So I see those introductions coming in now. We'll wait about 30 more seconds and then get started. Great, thanks. We'll go ahead and get started because we only have an hour together, and that goes quickly, as we all know. So we're very pleased to have you join us here for this webinar co-organized by the OECD Local Development Forum and the Economic Development Association of Scotland. Today, we'll be diving into the OECD's new publication, Job Creation and Local Economic Development 2023, Bridging the Great Green Divide, with a focus on international lessons for Scotland, United Kingdom. So if we pull up the next slide, I'll go ahead and go without the slide. Our hour together today is broken into two different parts. We'll start with the scene setting component, with presentations from the OECD and Skills Development Scotland. This will help get us situated in the international and local context, understand some of the latest research on the jobs and skills implications of the green transition, and get an idea of how the experience of Scotland compares internationally. We'll then move to our panel discussion, where we'll travel virtually, of course, to Sweden and the United States before coming back to Scotland to get the private sector perspective. But before we jump into the main event, just a few housekeeping items. As I said in the opening, we encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat and ask questions using the Q&A function. I'd also like to remind you that this webinar will be recorded in case you missed something. So without further ado, I'd like to now hand over the floor to my colleague, Christine Lankenbucher, Head of the Local Employment and Skills Unit within the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions, and Cities, who will present some of the key findings from the OECD's new publication. Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everybody joining today, this lead program. And in fact, I feel particularly honored for having this opportunity to present to you program, and I'm just the one giving it a face today. And a green one with my jacket. So the green transition is obviously just one of the many things that impacts on skills demand in our labor markets today. There are many other drivers as well, like automation and digitalization. And this is always the point where, well, right now I still make the point of saying I've not written this publication with the help of ChatGPT. It was still me and the team together. I don't know how much longer we make this claim. There will be quite of an element of further more automation and digitalization that impacts on our labor markets. And together with the green transition, it's always very often been talked of a twin transition. But there are many other underlying factors that are really important for our labor markets. We just take demographic change, and just to put in some numbers for the UK here, for example, if you looked in the UK in the year 2000, you would have had 27 people of the age of 65 years and over for every 100 people of working age. Today, this year, it's already 34 people over the age of 65. And by 2050, it will be 47 people above 65 for the working age population. So there's also many other needs that drive our labor markets. Obviously, globalization is another one. With COVID, we're rethinking a lot of our supply chains, but also the green transition is driving that. But now let's move on to the green transition, because this is what our webinar is about today. And here, as Anna already said, I wanted to present the findings from our latest publication called Job Creation and Local Economic Development. It's a publication that's published every 2 years, and this year it's on the green transition, especially labor markets. And we've given it the title of Bridging the Great Green Divide, which already gives away some of the findings of this publication, because there's a lot of divides emerging also because of the green transition. A quick overview here on the different elements that we cover in the publication. You have the QR code here to get more details on policy highlights, the full publication, obviously, and also country notes for over 30 countries, including one on the UK. And I think colleagues will also put in the chat the link directly to the webpage. So there's an element, obviously, to what green transition means for jobs and what we already know, the implications for local job skills and economic development, lessons from past transitions and the way forward. And I'll just now try to run through a few of these findings, and then for more, there's obviously time for questions and later to check out this publication. So the obviously most important question is, like, how do we actually define green jobs? And there's in fact many different ways of defining green jobs out there. We have decided to take a task-based approach, and this would mean that we consider a job as being green if it has at least 10% of its tasks contained within this job directly supporting sustainable development. So that I think makes sense in a lot of different jobs. You kind of see, for example, here a green engineer, or as a high skilled job, somebody working on setting up windmills for like a medium skilled job. But it's also, like, we often get this question, this would also mean that, for example, an accountant that works in the solar energy is not considered somebody contributing directly to the green transition, because they are they still do a regular accountant job and don't have green tasks themselves. So I think this is important to highlight, which in maybe other types of definitions they would be involved. Now, where do we stand? In fact, labor markets are greening, but they're greening slowly. That is one of the key findings in our publication. I think the headline figure is that around 18% of workers in the OECD have jobs that have a significant share of green tasks. So it's a substantial number of people, in fact, already, but it hasn't changed much over time. A decade ago, it was 16%. On the other hand, we see that the demand for green task jobs, it's growing quite a bit. So maybe when we measure these figures in coming years, we'll actually see a stronger growth, because we now see there's stronger demand for green task jobs, and maybe a lot of the policies that are in place have actually not fully translated in the way that we measure green task jobs. Now, as I said before, the publication has the word divide in its title, and that for a good reason, because there are a number of green job divides out there. A very obvious one is the geography of green jobs. One very important one to look at is obviously where are more green jobs, where of them are less. I said the average for the OECD is around 18%, but you see that there are some regions in the OECD where less than 10% of the jobs are green nowadays. And then you see regions where it's much more than this 18%, where it's 30% or more, for example, in Stockholm or Oslo, Ile-de-France here in France. And interestingly enough, it's very often, in fact, the capitals of countries where there's more or the highest number of green task jobs. Also, if you look into these divides, in fact, there are different in countries. Some countries have a much narrower gap than others, where it's 30%, or it's 10% or more, the gap between the places with the lowest and the highest number of green task jobs. For example, in the United States, France, Finland, Hungary, we actually have 10 percentage points or more of a gap. Then obviously we're here to also have a closer look at the UK today, and especially Scotland. So this is what I try to do with this slide, looking at the regional labour markets in the UK and especially Scotland. So what you see in this chart, the green bars are in fact the number of green task or the proportion of green task jobs in 2020 in the different UK regions. And the Scottish regions you see here in the bit more turquoise type of green tone, that's for 2020. The little triangles are the data for 2019, and the little squares are the numbers for 2011. So what we see here is obviously that on average, the UK is a bit higher than the OECD average. In most regions in the UK, green task jobs have also been growing, and also in Scotland outperforms the OECD average, but is slightly below the average for the UK. Now, a next way to look at it is actually to look at the opposite, at polluting jobs, which are also very often dubbed as brown jobs. Here I'll just present the findings for the UK. Obviously, this is an area where the UK has already undergone industrial transformations for many, many decades. So on average, we actually find that fewer people are employed in the UK in these polluting jobs than in the OECD on average. And also many regions recorded a further decrease of these type of jobs over the last decade. Scotland here is very close to the UK average, with around 5.7% of workers being employed in polluting jobs. And I think this is just important to have in mind, because obviously the green transition will also imply that more of those jobs go, but then what happens to workers? But more on that later on. Now, another important issue for us to look at is in fact by gender. So we wanted to see, like, well, who's actually holding these green task jobs? And it turns out that green task jobs are mainly held by men. 72% of green jobs are held by men, and only 28% are held by women. And what we try to do as a little, thought experiment for this study is like looking, what would happen if you would want to have gender parity in those 30 countries that we cover in the study? And in fact, 20 million women would need to change jobs into a green job in order to reach gender parity. And obviously that begs the question on why would we actually want to achieve gender parity also in green task jobs? Because that's another area where if we don't do anything about it, it could further exacerbate unequal labor market outcomes also between men and women, because green task jobs on average are characterized by higher levels of education, they require higher skills levels, and they usually come with a wage premium of having 20 to 30% higher wages than non-green jobs. So certainly something to have in mind in our work on the green transition. Here just the numbers also for the UK and for Scotland, showing that the share of green jobs in the UK is in fact slightly higher than the OECD average. And in Scotland, the rate is just slightly below the UK average, but still higher than the average for the OECD. Now I've given you loads of numbers, so I think we want to fast move on to the policy discussions. So what's the way forward? What actions can we take to bridge these green divides across communities? Here, just some general thoughts on local and national success drivers from past transitions. Obviously, the green transition is something new, but there's also a lot we can learn from the transition from coal, digitalization, globalization. One important point we notice is obviously that the green transition is more policy driven than market driven, whereas many of those other previous transitions were more market driven. But still, I think there are important lessons to learn in order to make the green transition also a fair transition. A very first one is about obviously having a vision and a strategy, and I think we'll hear more about that also in the presentations that follow. Obviously, this is something that needs to happen proactively, especially as it's policy driven. The necessity to have strong coalitions, which was the case for many other transitions in the past. This is also something we very often hear in other contexts. We just had a other workshop last week where we discussed with public employment services, and they stressed how important it is to bring together national, regional, and local stakeholders, but also cross-functional working groups, because this is not only about labor market, this is about bringing together policymakers that work on the green transition together with those that work on labor market policies. The very same is true, obviously, for reskilling programs, both for people who are at risk of losing their jobs because of the transitions, those that have already lost their job, and also for all those needs in new occupations and in areas where new jobs emerge because of the green transition. And obviously, this also means investing in the attractiveness of a region and fostering innovation. I finished my presentation with just 3 examples that pick up a bit on these topics that I've mentioned just now. The first one is actually from Copenhagen, that indeed works on having this type of strategy that involves the collaboration of a range of local and regional actors. And they also have a very strong focus on young people, which I find very important because I think we hear a lot from young people today that they have a very high interest in doing something meaningful with their lives. So I think we also need to capitalize on this enthusiasm by young people. This is also something which resonates with the work that, for example, is being done in New York, where internships in clean businesses are supported, but also to make it a fair transition, especially for individuals from underserved communities. And finally, an example from Brussels, which I think brings exactly this point of the need of working different portfolios and bringing the construction sector for labor force support, for finding the right subsidies to support this the sector. So with that,
force advantage, the plan for the city region and accompanying skills action, energy generation and transmission, retrofit of buildings, transport and land use. But there's still significant uncertainty and competition amongst technologies that makes accurately forecasting future skills demands challenging. We need to understand the regulatory and policy environment and frameworks for transition, and that's a really important of understanding what the future needs will be. Second lesson, and came out in our green jobs report, and that suggested that for every brand new job that was created within the green transition, there will be another 2 that we already exist but we need more of, and another 6 that already exist but require upskilling or reskilling. And we think this will require the skills system to pivot quite significantly from primarily investing in school to work transitions to a more balanced portfolio that's better able to support upskilling and reskilling throughout individuals' career. this will need a significant commitment to change the systems that are in place at the moment. And the third lesson, and we're all acutely aware of this, is recognizing the straitened times of public finance. Trying to drive change in the skills system is difficult at any time, but trying to do it in a time of such scarce resources is even more challenging. Cost of living crisis, the cost of doing business crisis, the slow recovery of public finances post-COVID, these all contribute to significant pressure on public sector budgets and indeed individual business budgets. Driving change in these times requires creative thinking, and we'd like to see that from politicians, from public sector leaders, and from skills providers themselves. These themes will be picked up in an updated climate emergency skills action plan, which will be led by the Scottish Government and is due to be published later this year. Without further ado, I'd like to do a huge welcome to three fabulous panelists who are going to bring some of their experiences from America, from Sweden, and a huge thank you to
individual needs to benefit our past in the climate careers. Programs will ownership or high. So we're
an enormous increase in people that needs to move to the north of Sweden so that we can be successful in this green transformation. And because of that, we need to work on a greater geographical mobility, both within Sweden, but also outside. And we try to identify possible activities, collaboration to better meet the green transition needs. But we've only been up and running for 4 months. We've been up and running for about 7 months, but full scale for 4 months. So we haven't looking to what extent so with the thresholds, so that it will be easy. But not everyone wants to live up here, so we need to find a way to get people to understand that you should live in the north of Sweden. We are currently looking into changing vocational training. So instead of having people up here doing the training course, you can do your training course where you live and then come up and do your work experience in the north where the jobs are. And then hopefully when you're done with your education and you get a job, you feel that, well, now I have the financial stability to move, because it costs a lot to be a student. So to move to go to do a training course might not be what people want to do. And what we see there is about 20% of these 100,000 jobs that come in are jobs that need